The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Genocide, by Annalisa Bell, Constance McKinney, and Raquel Sarmiento. The Rape of Nanking was a 6-week massacre that began on December 13, 1937, in the city of Nanking, China. The Japanese army was sent with orders to kill all captives. Over the 6 weeks, the Japanese army occupied Nanking and wreaked havoc over the Chinese citizens by raping, looting, and murdering en masse. It was estimated that approximately 300,000 Chinese citizens were killed during those 6 weeks, many of whom were innocent women and children. Over 20,000 Chinese women were raped by the Japanese soldiers. There were even competitions between the Japanese soldiers to see who could kill the most people. The Japanese government refused to admit that there was such a large-scale massacre committed by their army. They conceded that the killings occurred at the hand of their army, but denied the large scale of events. This presentation will discuss the circumstances, reasons, history, and consequences of this mass genocide. Japan and China had a very checkered past. For centuries, Chinese culture has greatly impacted the Japanese people, linking the two together. But one of the great Japanese unifiers, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, desired to occupy China by way of Korea. His advances were halted and the Japanese armies retreated, where they would stay for a few hundred years. After Japan had witnessed China's downfall in the First and Second Opium Wars, they knew that they had to industrialize and reinvent their army. After a period of regrouping, the Japanese invaded China once again, this time through Port Arthur and beginning the First Sino-Japanese War. This war ended with an agreement between the two governments that opened Chinese ports to trade and also allowed the building of factories by foreign countries. During the First World War, Japan drafted their 21 demands of the Chinese government and forced the Chinese to accept them. There were also smaller skirmishes between the two armies, but violence escalated when the Japanese army invaded Shanghai. The battle at Shanghai during the summer of 1937 was a tipping point for the Japanese army. They expected to invade Shanghai and conquer all of China in 3 months. However, the Chinese troops' resistance was much stronger than they expected. This rose the Japanese army's frustrations and gave them a stronger drive to defeat China. The Chinese army held out until November, when Shanghai was finally defeated. After their victory, the Japanese forces marched on to Nanking. One of the main reasons for the atrocities that occurred during the Rape of Nanking was the role of Japanese culture. A main focus of Japan's was to expand its country into a global superpower by any means possible. Japan instilled nationalist and militaristic ideals into their society in an attempt to train soldiers and gain widespread support for what they perceived as an inevitable war with China. For example, during the 1930s, Japanese toy shops began emphasizing the importance of serving and supporting one's country. They began to sell items such as toy soldiers, tanks, bugles, and etc. Furthermore, Japanese officials also began to push these nationalistic and militaristic ideals inside of classrooms as well. Teachers lectured students about how important it was for the expansion of the Japanese nation, as doing so would fulfill its quote-unquote divine destiny of conquering Asia. They also taught children how to handle weapons, both toy and real ones. However, the emphasis of these ideals alone didn't lead to the mass genocide. Japan perceived China as a threat to its fulfillment of its divine destiny, so they began to instill hatred of the Chinese in young Japanese students. They used derogatory language and stereotypes to demean the Chinese, and ingrained the idea that they would one day invade China and become the most powerful influence in Asia. The Japanese had no history of violence or treatment of cruelty before the Rape of Nanking. Historians note that during the Russo-Japanese War of the early 1900s, Japanese officials treated those that they had conquered with respect and decency. However, the hatred for the Chinese and their nationalistic desire to expand the Japanese nation resulted in the mass genocide and the destruction of the city. After conquering Shanghai during the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japanese troops moved to invade Nanking, which was the capital of China at the time. A prominent Chinese military leader, Chiang Kai-shek, ordered the evacuation of all official Chinese troops from the city and replaced them with untrained auxiliary troops. This was done as to avoid the deaths of soldiers that they needed to continue the war. Kai-shek also forbade citizens from leaving the city. Essentially, the Chinese auxiliary soldiers and citizens were all sitting ducks for when the Japanese troops acted on orders to destroy the city and execute all prisoners of war. This was done because if the Chinese prisoners were murdered, they wouldn't need to be fed. Additionally, the deaths reduced the chance of uprising and retaliations forming. Soldiers were more likely to follow these orders because they believed they were doing it to secure the power for the nation, in addition to the fact that they were trained to hate the Chinese. All of these circumstances led to the mass genocide, rape, and torture of the people of Nanking. Japanese officials encouraged young soldiers to engage in these war crimes in order to both toughen themselves up and to show other nations that they would not be merciful. The event was the second worst mass rape of world history, as women of all ages were targeted. It also led to the deaths of approximately 200 to 300,000 people. As previously stated, the Chinese population was basically left to fend for themselves. Due to the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese soldiers were too weak to fight against the well-trained and better-equipped Japanese army. In a national broadcast to the Chinese people on December 1st, 1937, Chiang Kai-shek tried to ignite a resistance movement. He raised the hopes of those living in the city by claiming that help would come and that they would take the fight to the invaders. He also appealed to their values of patriotism, freedom, and sacrifice. He promised that they would not give up and fight to the death to protect Nanking. Some people may have believed his sentiments and taken up arms to defend the city. Chiang, however, committed a big mistake by listening to his advisor, Tang Shengzi. He was assigned to organize the army. According to Jonathan Spencer, Tang was not loyal to Chiang, and his goal was to gain the people's popularity. Tang organized 100,000 unskilled and unprepared men that could not stop the Japanese soldiers from moving towards the city. Many of these conscripts could hardly be called soldiers, as they lacked the basic training, discipline, and a strategy required for a resistance movement. On December 12th, Tang withdrew his troops and fled, ignoring his oath to defend Nanking. Iris Chang, in her book, The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II, states that Azumo Shiro, a former Japanese soldier, wrote in his diary that one night he and his troops were searching for Chinese soldiers, and they found 7,000 men gathered waiting for the Japanese soldiers to fetch them so that they could surrender to the Japanese army. According to Shiro, he felt sorry to see how pitiful the Chinese soldiers were as they begged for their lives. The Chinese were utterly beaten down, undernourished, and hopeless. It was very difficult for the Chinese to properly organize a resistance movement, as Japan had orders to execute all prisoners. Prior to the Japanese invasion of Nanking, the city had a thriving expatriate community of businessmen, clergy, missionaries, educators, and diplomats. Many departed the city when the Japanese invaded, but a good number stayed behind. Those that remained were the eyes and ears for the rest of the world, as they reported the human rights abuses and tyranny imposed on the Chinese citizens. The international community formed a committee that helped create the Nanking Safe Zone for the Chinese. Although the Japanese ruled over their conquered subjects with an iron fist, the International Committee was able to save many people from being harmed and filed formal protests within the occupation army. The Nanking Safe Zone also was able to document the facts for future generations to read and judge. This is one case where the victors were not able to write their own virtuous history of what happened in Nanking, as the writings and reports of the international community were irrefutable evidence that could counter any retelling of the facts to downplay the brutality and evil acts of the Japanese. Accountability for the Japanese individuals that took part in the rape of Nanking is almost non-existent in Japan. The Japanese government and many of its citizens deny any sort of massacre ever occurring. They concede that men in the Chinese army died because there was a battle, but they refute the high numbers that the Chinese have reported. They also adamantly deny that the reported raping and looting ever even happened. In 2013, Japanese author Nobukatsu Fujioka said, quote, "It was a battlefield, so people were killed, but there was no systematic massacre or rape. The Chinese government hired actors and actresses, pretending to be the victims when they invited some Japanese journalists to write about them. All of the photographs that China uses as evidence of the massacre are fabricated." Many Japanese people believe that this rumored massacre was just another example of, quote, Japan bashing. Today, it is still a hotly contested subject around the globe, with many people still upholding the idea that the massacre never happened. This also includes the Tokyo governor in 2018, who said, quote, Let me be clear that it would have been absolutely impossible for the Japanese army to kill 400,000 people with the equipment for that period of time. However, there were several war crimes tribunals that occurred. They judged Japanese military leaders and soldiers. Many of the war crimes tribunals found these individuals guilty of murder, torture, rape, looting, etc., which helped bring some closure for the victims and their families. Overall, escalating tensions between China and Japan, an ingrained racism towards the Chinese, and a strong desire for power and world domination all contributed to the atrocities that occurred in Nanking. History often forgets about the lives ruined and lost due to the Japanese army's actions, as the government attempts to bury the truth despite the well-documented evidence and photographs. However, it's important that people learn, understand, and spread the facts surrounding this horrible tragedy so that we may never let this history repeat itself.